Elias Mercer slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table like he was closing a business deal he'd already moved on from. He didn't look up, didn't say her name, just tapped the signature line with one finger and said, "I need this done by Thursday." Serena Vale sat across from him, the woman who had spent 4 years making his coffee before he woke up, who had learned to sleep quietly so she wouldn't disturb him, who had stopped crying in front of him because he'd told her once that it made her look weak. She looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. He was already checking his phone. She picked up the pen and signed. No argument, no scene. She folded her copy, put it in her bag, and left the house with the same quiet she'd carried into it 4 years ago. The door didn't even slam. Elias celebrated that night at a rooftop bar with Claudia Voss, his new girlfriend, who laughed too loudly and wore things Serena never would have. He told his friends the marriage had simply run its course. He said it with the confidence of a man who believed his own story. 3 days later, Charleston Harbor stopped breathing. If you've ever dismissed someone because they were too quiet, if you've ever looked at a person and seen nothing, stay with this story. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, because this one is going to travel far. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and don't go anywhere. You are not going to see this ending coming. Part 1. The morning the yacht arrived, Elias was at his office on the 14th floor of the Mercer Group building, reviewing a partnership proposal that had come in overnight. It was a good morning. Clean desk, fresh coffee. Claudia had texted him something that made him smile. Life, by every measure he understood, was working. His assistant Marcus knocked twice and pushed the door open without waiting for an answer, which was unusual enough that Elias looked up. "You need to see the harbor," Marcus said. "I'm in the middle of—" "Sir." Marcus wasn't a dramatic person. He had worked for Elias for 6 years and had never once interrupted a meeting to suggest anyone look at anything. The expression on his face now was not excitement. It was something closer to unease. "The harbor, now." Elias went to the window. The vessel moving through the channel was unlike anything he had seen in person. Black hull with gold trim that caught the morning light like it was lit from inside, easily 200 feet, maybe more. It moved with an unhurried confidence that made every other boat in the harbor look like debris. Behind it, flanking it at measured distances, came 4 smaller craft loaded with men in tactical gear, their silhouettes visible even from 14 floors up. Between them, the larger boat didn't hurry. It didn't need to. The harbor authority had apparently cleared the channel. Elias could see that the usual traffic, the ferry, 2 container vessels that should have been moving, had all been redirected or stopped. Someone had made calls before the ship arrived. Someone had arranged the water. "What is that?" Elias asked. Marcus said, "The Moretti crest." Elias turned. "The what?" "The gold emblem on the bow. I looked it up when someone sent me the photo 20 minutes ago." Marcus held up his phone. "That's the Moretti Syndicate's private fleet. That specific vessel, that's the flagship. That's the one they call the Sovereign." Elias had heard of the Morettis the way most people had heard of them, through the kind of news that ran below the fold, the kind that used words like alleged and reported ties, because no one in their right mind put anything stronger in print. They were American in the way that things born from immigration and violence become American. Woven into the infrastructure, invisible in plain sight, operating through layers of legitimate business that had long since made the criminal origins almost beside the point. They were, by most accounts, untouchable. Their flagship did not visit Charleston. "Why is it here?" Elias said. Marcus shook his head. "That's what everyone's asking." By the time Elias got down to street level and made his way 3 blocks to the waterfront, a crowd had already gathered. Not a chaotic crowd, but the quiet, still kind. People standing with their phones up and their mouths open, unsure whether what they were seeing was spectacular or threatening. Harbor security had set a perimeter, but it was clearly decorative. The men on the escort boats were armed in a way that made the harbor officers look like they were dressed for Halloween. The Sovereign came to rest at the main pier with a precision that suggested its crew had docked in difficult conditions too many times to find this particular exercise interesting. Lines went out, gangway deployed. Everything moved with the choreography of an organization that did not improvise. Then the gangway doors opened and the bodyguards came first. 4 of them, big men in dark suits, scanning the crowd with the flat professional attention of people paid to notice threats. They moved to the edges of the crimson carpet that 2 deck crew were unrolling, and they stood there, and they waited. Then a man came down. Elias had seen photographs of Damiano Moretti in the kind of articles that got shared in business circles with nervous commentary. In photographs, he looked like what he was, a man of substantial power and controlled menace, somewhere in his mid-40s, the kind of face that didn't give much away because it had learned early that expression was a liability. In person, he was something different. He was taller than the photograph suggested, and the way he moved through the crowd, or rather, the way the crowd moved around him without him asking, said everything. He walked down the gangway and stopped at the base of it, turned to look back up at the ship. The crowd had gone very still. A woman appeared at the top of the gangway. She was wearing a dark dress, and her hair was down, and she walked with the careful balance of someone who had not yet adjusted to solid ground after days at sea. She wasn't hurrying, she wasn't performing. She just came down the gangway like she had walked off ships before, like this was simply the next thing that happened. It took Elias 11 full seconds to understand that he was looking at Serena, not the Serena who had signed his divorce papers 3 days ago without a word, not the Serena who used to apologize for asking what he wanted for dinner. This woman descended the gangway of the most powerful criminal organization's flagship vessel in an American harbor, and when she reached the bottom, Damiano Moretti, a man the Justice Department had spent 15 years and considerable resources attempting to successfully prosecute, turned to face her and went down on one knee. The crowd went completely silent. "Princess of the Moretti family," Damiano said, and his voice carried in the stillness. "Welcome home." Serena's expression didn't change. There was no surprise in it, no performance for the crowd, no visible satisfaction. She simply looked at him and said quietly, "Get up, Damiano. You don't kneel." He rose. And the way he rose, immediately, without hesitation, told Elias more than anything else could have. This was not a man who answered to many people. He had knelt to Serena Vale, and he had done it in public, and he had done it without embarrassment. Elias opened his mouth. He wasn't entirely sure what he intended to say. Her name, maybe. Or a question. Or some sound his body needed to make to process the information his brain was refusing to organize. What came out was, Serena. She heard him. He could tell because something shifted in her posture. Not toward him, not dramatically, just a small settling, like someone who'd anticipated a bump in the road and was bracing without making a show of it. She didn't turn immediately. When she did turn, she looked at him the way you look at something you once paid a great deal of attention to and have since learned to see clearly. Not with contempt, not with warmth, with the steady, neutral recognition of someone who has already done the accounting and closed the books. "Elias," she said. That was all. His name. Said the way you'd acknowledge a piece of furniture you donated to charity and then encountered again at someone else's house. One of the bodyguards stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the practiced efficiency of someone whose job was to manage exactly this kind of complication. He positioned himself between Elias and Serena with the physical language of a closed door. "Sir," the bodyguard said, and the word contained no hostility and no warmth and absolute finality. Elias stood there with the harbor wind coming off the water and 200 people with their phones pointed at him and said nothing because there was nothing in his vocabulary for this. Serena turned back toward the pier. Damiano fell into step beside her, and the bodyguards formed around them both. And that was the end of it. Elias watched her walk away. He had done this before, 3 days ago, when she left the house with her small suitcase. He had watched her go then too, and he had felt nothing, or nothing he had named. He had told himself, had genuinely believed, that her quietness was its own kind of emptiness. That a woman who didn't fight wasn't a woman who decided you weren't worth fighting. That silence was absence. He stood at the harbor and revised this understanding in real time and found the revision humiliating. His phone began to ring. He didn't answer it. Then it rang again, immediately, and when he looked at the screen it was his attorney, Leonard Voss, Claudia's uncle, the man who had introduced them, the man who had spent the last 8 months helpfully explaining to Elias why the marriage to Serena was an obstacle to the company's next phase of growth. "Leonard," Elias said, "turn around and go back to the office." Leonard's voice was tight in a way Elias had never heard from him. Leonard was 71 years old and had been a corporate attorney for 45 years, and his voice was never tight. "Do not speak to her. Do not speak to anyone near her. Go back to the office and do not speak to the press." "What?" "Elias." A pause. Something careful being decided on the other end of the line. "How much do you actually know about who Serena's family is?" Elias looked at the yacht. "Apparently nothing," he said. Come back to the office. Now. He went. But on the elevator ride up, his phone lit up with 3 messages in quick succession, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 from his CFO, Raymond Chu, whose message read only, "Call me. Urgent. Investors are asking questions." By the time Elias reached his floor, Raymond was already in his office, standing at the window looking out at the harbor where the Sovereign was still visible, enormous and still. "The Whitfield Group called 20 minutes ago," Raymond said, without turning. "They're withdrawing their capital commitment." "Why?" "They didn't say why. They just said they were withdrawing." Raymond turned. "Then Cascade Partners called. Same thing. No explanation. Then Harmon Capital." He paused. "Elias, that's $62 million in committed funding that has evaporated in the last 30 minutes. Elias sat down in his chair. "Does this have anything to do with—" Raymond gestured toward the window. "I don't know," Elias said. But the thing was, he was starting to. Not the specifics, not the mechanics of how it was happening, but the shape of it, the way the timeline fit, the way 30 minutes ago he had been standing at the harbor watching Serena Vale step off a Mafia syndicate's flagship. And now $62 million in funding was gone. The shape of it was becoming visible. Raymond said, "I need you to tell me if there's something I don't know." "I don't know anything," Elias said. "That's the problem." Across town, in the hotel suite the Moretti organization had arranged. 7 floors, top of the Alderman, the entire floor cleared and secured. Serena Vale was standing at the window looking at the harbor from the other direction when her closest aide, a composed woman named Petra, who had been with the Moretti organization for 12 years, knocked and came in. "Mercer Group stock is down 4%, Petra said, setting a tablet on the table beside Serena. 3 institutional investors withdrew this morning. All 3 held positions that were originally established through the Whitfield Proxy Fund." Serena didn't turn from the window. "I know. Do you want to move on the remaining positions?" A pause. "Not yet." Petra waited. Serena said, "He built that company on a foundation he didn't understand. I wanted him to. I thought—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought. For what it's worth," Petra said carefully, "the board records confirm that Voss was the one who initiated the divorce recommendation. He framed it as a liability management strategy." Serena turned from the window. "Of course he did. You don't seem surprised. I've had 4 years to understand Leonard Voss." Serena moved to the table and looked at the tablet. "What surprised me wasn't that he wanted me out. It was that Elias didn't ask why." She said it without particular bitterness, just as an observation, a thing she had looked at for a long time and learned to see accurately. Petra said, "Damiano wants a briefing at 6. The Romero situation is moving faster than the analysts projected." Serena nodded. "I'll be there." Then after a moment, "Petra, who recommended Voss to Elias originally before I married him? Who made that introduction?" Petra's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "That's a question that's going to open a large file." "I know," Serena said. "Open it." 4 years ago, Serena Vale had left the Moretti world because she was 26 and bleeding and her mother was dead, and she wanted to believe there was a version of life that didn't require knowing where all the exits were. She had chosen Elias partly because he was uncomplicated in ways she found exhausting to examine too closely, and partly because his world was ordinary in a way that felt, at the time, like safety. She had learned, slowly, and then all at once, the way you learn most true things, that ordinary did not mean safe. It just meant the knives were smaller, and the people who held them believed they were reasonable. She had not told him who she was. She knew now, with the clarity of someone who has had years and distance to examine a decision, that this was not something she could have explained in a way he would have understood. She had tried once, early in their relationship, to describe the world she'd come from. Not the full truth, but the shape of it. He had laughed, gently, and said she had an imagination. He had meant it as a compliment. She had stopped trying after that. What she had not stopped doing was watching. Watching his company struggle and quietly ensuring, through several layers of insulation, that it didn't fail. Not because she owed him that. Not because she expected anything from it. But because she had been trained from childhood by people who understood that leverage was most useful when the person you held it over didn't know you were holding it, and some habits persisted even when the strategic rationale was gone. Now the rationale was back. At 6 o'clock, Serena sat across from Damiano in the secured conference room on the hotel's top floor, and Damiano laid out what the intelligence team had confirmed in the last 72 hours. The Romero cartel had known her location for 9 months. 9 months, Serena said. Yes, that's before the divorce was filed. Damiano's jaw tightened. Yes, she looked at him steadily. So Voss wasn't just an opportunist who saw an opening. No. Damiano placed a photograph on the table, a man she didn't recognize. His name is Felix Carano. He's been Romero's operational coordinator in the southeastern United States for approximately 3 years. He was placed in Voss and Associates 14 months ago as a senior partner. Serena looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Damiano. The divorce wasn't about Elias wanting out. It was about drawing me out. That's our assessment, yes. The room held the silence for a moment. They needed me in this open, she said. If I'm Elias Mercer's unremarkable ex-wife, I'm invisible. If I surface as myself, you're a target, Damiano said, a visible one. Or, Serena said, and something in her voice had changed. Not harder, exactly, but settled, the way metal settles when it reaches operating temperature. I'm bait that knows it's bait. Damiano didn't say anything. They wanted me in the open, Damiano. Fine. She pushed the photograph back across the table. I'm in the open. Let's talk about what we do with that. Outside the hotel, 14 floors below, the city of Charleston continued its evening without knowing that the quiet woman who had lived among them for 4 years, who had bought her groceries and attended neighborhood meetings, and smiled at people in elevators, had never been who they thought she was. And 3 miles away, Elias Mercer sat in an office that was already beginning to hollow out around him, looking at withdrawal notices from investors whose names he now understood he had never actually known, trying to build a picture of something that had been assembled around him long before he'd understood he was standing inside it. His phone lit up. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. A man's voice, unfamiliar, said, Mr. Mercer, my name is Felix Carano. I think you and I have some mutual interest to discuss. Elias said nothing. The woman you divorced, Carano said. I'm curious how much you actually know about the trouble you may have just stumbled into. Meet me tonight. The Lantern Room, 9 o'clock. A pause. I promise I'm not the most dangerous person involved in this, not even close. The line went dead. Elias sat in the dark office with the harbor lights reflecting off his window and the sound of his own breathing, and for the first time in a very long time, he understood that every choice he had made for the past 4 years had been made inside a story someone else was writing, and he hadn't known it, and now the story had changed chapters, and no one was going to explain the plot to him. He thought about Serena at the harbor, the way she'd said his name. He thought about the way she hadn't looked surprised to see him there. He put on his coat and went to find out what Felix Carano wanted, which was the worst decision he would make in a night full of them. The Lantern Room was the kind of bar that had outlasted 3 recessions and 2 hurricanes by being useful to people who needed to talk without being watched. Exposed brick, low ceilings, booths in the back with high wooden dividers that had absorbed 40 years of private conversations. The kind of place where the bartender's professional skill was forgetting faces. Elias arrived 8 minutes early because he was nervous, and nervous people arrive early. He ordered whiskey he didn't intend to drink and took a booth near the back where he could see the door, which he'd read somewhere was the smart thing to do, and which gave him, now that he was doing it, absolutely no comfort. Felix Carano arrived exactly at 9. He was smaller than his voice had suggested, mid-50s, compact, with a careful face that had been arranged into something that resembled pleasantness, the way a hotel lobby resembles a home. He wore a gray suit that fit well, and moved through the bar like a man who'd spent time learning to move through places without attracting attention. He spotted Elias immediately, didn't look around, didn't hesitate, and came directly to the booth and sat down across from him. You ordered the Jameson, Carano said. Good choice. I've always found bourbon too aggressive for conversations like this. What kind of conversation is this? Elias said. Carano folded his hands on the table. An honest one, which I suspect you're not accustomed to getting from the people around you. He paused. Specifically from Leonard Voss. Elias felt something move in his chest. Not quite surprise. More like confirmation of a dread he'd been carrying since Raymond's phone call. What about Voss? He's been managing you, Carano said simply. Not advising you, managing you. There's a difference. He reached into his jacket, slowly, watching Elias's face, and placed a folded document on the table. That is a record of 12 transactions over the past 2 years in which Voss directed certain of your investor relationships in ways that served an interest other than yours. Elias looked at the document. Didn't touch it yet. What interest? Mine, Carano said. Among others. The honesty of it stopped Elias cold. He'd expected deflection, misdirection, the practiced layering of a man who'd spent years building cover. He hadn't expected the thing itself, placed on the table and named. You're telling me you used Voss to manipulate my company. I'm telling you Voss offered himself as a resource and I used him, yes. Carano tilted his head slightly. What I'm also telling you is that what I used him for was secondary to what he used you for. You were the mechanism. You weren't the point. Serena was the point. Carano looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been the performance of it. She told you. She told me nothing. I worked it out. Which wasn't entirely true, but Elias wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of knowing how lost he'd been 4 hours ago. Carano picked up the document and returned it to his jacket. Then you understand that the divorce wasn't your idea. The whiskey glass was cold under Elias's hand. He was aware of his own breathing, the way it had gone shallower since Carano sat down, the way his body was managing information his brain was still catching up to. Voss suggested it. Voss engineered it. The girlfriend, the timeline, the framing of Serena as an anchor on your ambitions. All of it was structured. You felt the feelings, I don't doubt that. But the conditions that produced them were arranged. Carano said it without cruelty. Like a mechanic explaining how something worked. You were a door, Mr. Mercer. We needed the door opened. Elias sat with that for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because the door is open now. And what comes through it next is going to be considerably more dangerous than anything that's happened so far. And I find myself in need of someone who can move through Serena Vale's proximity without raising the kind of alert that my usual resources would trigger. Carano leaned forward slightly. You're still her ex-husband. She said your name at the harbor. That means something. She said my name the way you'd acknowledge furniture. She said it, Carano said. She didn't look away. Whatever she told herself about closing that chapter, you still register. I can work with that. Elias looked at him. You want me to spy on her? I want you to have a conversation with her, that's all. One conversation relayed to me. In exchange, Carano placed something else on the table. A drive, small, matte black. Every proxy position currently unwinding from your investment structure gets restored. The money comes back. Your company survives the week. Elias stared at the drive. And if I say no? Carano sat back. Then I have no particular reason to protect you from what comes next. And things are about to get very loud in this city. Elias picked up his whiskey and drank it. It hit the back of his throat, and he set the glass down and looked at Felix Carano and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he was sitting across from a man who was not the top of anything, who was, himself, a door. I need to think, Elias said. You have until morning, Carano said. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Elias with the flat neutrality of a man who found this kind of conversation routine. Get some sleep, Mr. Mercer. You look like you haven't in a while. He left. The bar noise came back in around Elias like water filling a hole, the clink of glasses, low music, two women laughing near the front. And Elias sat alone in the booth and turned his phone over in his hands and didn't call anyone. He drove home and sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before going inside. At 9:47 that night, the secure communication system in Serena's hotel suite registered an incoming alert from Petra, who was monitoring a network of signals that the Moretti intelligence team had been running since the Sovereign entered American waters. Serena was still awake. She rarely slept before midnight and hadn't since the yacht departed 3 days ago. Sitting at the table with a cup of tea gone cold and a series of documents spread out in front of her. Petra knocked twice and opened the door. Carano made contact with Mercer. Serena didn't react visibly. When? 9 o'clock, the Lantern Room, 4 blocks from his office building. How long? 18 minutes. Serena looked at the documents in front of her. Did Mercer go home afterward? Yes. Alone. No calls from his phone since. He's thinking, she said it without inflection. What did we get from the room? Petra hesitated. Incomplete. Audio capture was partial. The booth dividers and ambient noise degraded the signal. We have fragments. What fragments? Petra read from her tablet. Voss, managed, the money comes back. And, she paused. One conversation. Serena picked up her cold tea, considered it, set it down. He offered Elias a trade, information about me in exchange for restoring the investment funding. That's consistent with what we recovered, yes. And Elias didn't call Voss after, didn't call Claudia, didn't call anyone. Serena stood and moved to the window. The harbor was dark now, the Sovereign lit against it in running lights. He's not going to take the deal, Petra said carefully. We can't be certain of that. No, Serena agreed. We can't. She turned from the window. Put someone on him tonight. Loose tail, nothing that would spook him. I want to know where he goes in the morning. And Carano? Carano is a symptom. Serena moved back to the table and picked up one of the documents. The Romero organization put him in Voss's firm 14 months ago, which means they started planning this approach before I had any contact with Elias's company through the proxy funds. She laid the document down and smoothed it flat with one hand. I've been assuming they found out about my connection to the Mercer Group and used it, but what if the sequence runs the other way? Petra looked at her. You think they were watching you before the proxy funds? I think someone told them where to look, Serena said. And the list of people who knew my location 4 years ago is very short. The room held that for a moment. Damiano knew, Petra said quietly. Damiano knew, Serena confirmed. So did my father's former security director who died 18 months ago. So did one other person. She picked up the document again. Pull the communication records between Voss and Associates and any entity connected to the Moretti organization from 5 years back to present. Every contact, every meeting, every transferred file. Petra's expression was careful. That's going to require Damiano's authorization for some of the internal records. I know. Are you going to tell him what you're looking for? Serena looked at her. Not yet. The next morning came gray and close, the kind of Charleston morning in late season where the air feels like a held breath. Elias was at his office before 7, which was earlier than he'd arrived in years. Raymond was already there, which told Elias the financial situation had not improved overnight. 12 more withdrew, Raymond said before Elias had his coat off. We're down to operational reserves. If nothing changes by Friday, I know. Elias hung up his coat. Get me every document we have on Leonard Voss's role in the Whitfield Group introduction. Everything. His correspondence, his recommendation memos, the due diligence he provided on the investors he brought in. Raymond looked at him. Elias. Get it. Raymond left. Elias sat at his desk and called Leonard Voss. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He sent a text. 3 words. Call me. Now. And watched the screen for 30 seconds. Nothing. He called Claudia. She answered on the second ring, her voice already carrying something careful in it, something that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Elias. Where's Leonard? A pause. Why? Claudia. Where is he? Another pause, longer. He left last night. He said something came up with a client and he had to go to New York. I haven't... Her voice shifted. Elias, what's happening? I've been seeing things online about the harbor, about... When did he leave? Around 10 o'clock. He called a car. I didn't... She stopped. What did you do? What did you get us into? The accusation landed crooked. He almost said I didn't get us into anything. This was done to us. But he heard the instinct for what it was. The reflex toward self-defense, toward making this Claudia's problem, toward the same deflection of blame that had made him not ask questions when Voss suggested the divorce, when the investors came in too easily, when everything about his last 2 years had been slightly too smooth for a man who knew, somewhere in the back of his chest, that he hadn't earned it. I'll call you later, he said. He hung up and sat for a moment, and then did something that cost him more than he anticipated. He called the direct number for the Alderman Hotel and asked for the Moretti party's floor. The phone rang once. A man's voice said, Yes. My name is Elias Mercer. I need to speak with Serena. He stopped. Tried again. With Ms. Vale. Silence on the line. Then, hold. He held for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He counted. Then Serena's voice, clear and unhurried. Elias, I need to see you. A pause that was not long but felt considered. Why? Because Felix Carano met me last night and offered me money to get close to you and report back. And I didn't take the deal, and I think you probably already know that. And I think there's something happening here that's larger than either of us knows the full shape of, and I don't... He stopped, steadied himself. I don't know what else to do. The silence on her end was different now, quieter in a way that wasn't blank. She said, "Come at noon, come alone, tell no one." She hung up. He sat in his office for 4 hours doing almost nothing useful, reviewing documents Raymond brought, signing things that needed signing, performing the mechanical routines of running a company that was disintegrating around him with a calm he didn't feel. At 11:30, he told Marcus he had a private appointment, took the stairs down instead of the elevator, and walked the 6 blocks to the Alderman in the gray morning air. The lobby had been seamlessly managed. 2 men near the elevator who weren't hotel guests, positioned with the practiced naturalness of people who'd done this in many lobbies. They looked at Elias without speaking, and one of them made a brief gesture with his left hand, and the elevator opened and Elias got in, and the panel showed only one floor illuminated, the top, and the doors closed. Serena met him in the suite's main room, not the conference room. She was standing when he arrived, not sitting, which he registered as meaningful without being able to say exactly why. She looked like she hadn't slept more than a few hours, but she wore it the way some people wore fatigue. Not as weakness, but as proof of sustained effort, like a runner at mile 20 who's still keeping pace. Petra was in the room. She didn't leave. Elias sat down because Serena gestured toward the chair, and he was not in a position to perform casualness right now. You already know about the meeting with Carano. Yes. Audio. Partial. He nodded. He told me the divorce was engineered, that Voss was working for him, or for whoever Voss is working for. He looked at her directly. I don't know how much of that you know. Most of it, Serena said. Not all. He said you registered. When you said my name at the harbor, he said he could use that. Elias paused. I'm telling you this because I think you should know what they think they can exploit. Something passed through Serena's face, gone quickly. What did you tell him? I told him I needed to think. Elias looked at his hands. I didn't call him this morning. I called you instead. Serena was quiet for a moment. Then she moved to the chair across from him and sat down, and the slight shift in the room, Petra straightening almost imperceptibly, the recalibration of a space when its center of gravity moves, told Elias that this was not a casual gesture. She was choosing to be at his level. That cost her something. He could see it. The proxy funds, she said. In your company. You know about those. I've guessed. Don't guess. No. She looked at him steadily. I put $17 million into your company over 3 years through a series of shielded investment structures. When you were losing the Harmon contract in year 2, I arranged the bridge financing. When the Aldcroft development fell through, I absorbed the exposure. She said it plainly, without anger, without expectation, like reading a ledger. You never knew. He sat with it. Why? The question sat between them. Because I was your wife, she said finally, and because I was raised by people who understood that you protect what you're attached to, even when the attachment is painful. She paused. And because I was not ready to stop being attached. The honesty of it hit him somewhere below argument. Serena, don't. Her voice didn't rise. I'm not telling you this so you feel something about it. I'm telling you because Carano knows about the proxy funds. He's been monitoring those structures, which means he knows the extent to which I was invested in protecting you, and he will use that information to characterize our current interaction as something other than what it is. She leaned forward slightly. If you speak to him again, or to Voss, if Voss surfaces, you need to understand the narrative they're constructing and why. What narrative? That I have a vulnerability, she said, that my judgment on anything connected to you is compromised. She said it with the flat clarity of someone who had examined the claim and found it partially true and was not going to flinch from that. They're going to use whatever you feel, or whatever I feel, as a lever. That's the play. Elias said, Is it true? That your judgment is compromised? She looked at him for a long moment. I'm having this conversation with you instead of routing your call through security, so I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Before he could respond, Petra's tablet emitted a sharp tone. Petra looked at the screen and her posture changed, not dramatically, But Elias had been in enough boardrooms to recognize the specific shift of someone receiving information that reclassifies everything else in the room. Damiano needs to see you immediately, Petra said, looking at Serena. They've identified the source of the location breach. Serena stood. Something moved across her face, not quite fear, not quite anger, closer to the expression of someone who'd suspected a particular answer for a long time and was now being told they were right, and finding that rightness cost more than they'd planned for. Who? Serena said. Petra looked briefly at Elias, then back at Serena. Tell me, Serena said. The records trace to a communication sent 22 months ago from inside the Moretti organization's own internal network. Petra's voice was careful. Sent to a Romero-affiliated address in New Orleans. Another pause. The originating account belongs to Marco Fierro. The name meant nothing to Elias, but what it did to Serena's face told him it meant something close to everything. Marco Fierro was not an abstract figure in the Moretti world. He was the man who had carried Serena out of the burning safe house the night her mother died, who had held her in the back of an armored car while she was 13 years old and bleeding from glass in her left arm, and told her, with a steadiness she had not questioned in 20 years, that her father had arranged everything, that she would be safe, that the organization would protect her. He had been the first person she trusted after that night, possibly the only person for a long time. He was also, she now understood, the person who had told the Romero cartel where she was living. She left the room without a word to Elias. Petra followed. The bodyguard outside the suite door fell into step behind them. Elias sat alone in the room for approximately 90 seconds before a second bodyguard appeared at the door and said, politely and without menace, that he could be escorted to the lobby. He went to the lobby. He stood on the alderman's front steps in the gray midday air and understood that he had just been present for something he hadn't been given enough context to fully interpret, and that whatever it was, the shape of the entire situation had shifted again while he was inside. On the 14th floor of the conference suite, Damiano Moretti was standing at the head of the table with Marco Fierro's communication record on the screen behind him when Serena walked in. He didn't need to ask if she'd been told. He could see it in the way she moved. She sat down across from him, didn't look at the screen, looked at Damiano. How long have you known? She said. Since 3 this morning. You waited 9 hours. I needed to verify. Damiano. Her voice was quiet, not loud, the kind of quiet that is its own form of pressure. How long have you known? He held her gaze. I had a preliminary indication 4 days ago, before we arrived in Charleston. Serena sat back. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you, he said. I knew what it would. Where is Marco now? Damiano's jaw tightened. He was on the Sovereign. He's currently in custody. Yes. On my ship, Serena said. Yes. She stood up, moved to the window. Outside, the city was going about its business below her, indifferent and continuous. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass and held them there for a moment, very still. My father trusted him, she said. I trusted him. I know. He was in that car with me. After my mother... She stopped. He sat with me for 6 hours in that car. I know, Damiano said again, and his voice had changed. Not softer, but stripped of management, which for Damiano was the closest thing to soft. The night of the attack, Serena said. The one that killed my mother. She turned from the window. Her face was composed in the way that things are composed under very high pressure. Not natural calm, but achieved stillness, the kind that has a cost. Marco was the one who told us the route was secure. The room went very still. Damiano said nothing. He told us the route was secure, Serena said, and then 2 hours later my mother's car was hit at the point where the security grid had a gap that hadn't been there at the last patrol. She looked at Damiano directly. The breach 22 months ago wasn't the first time. Serena, my mother didn't die because the Romero cartel got lucky, she said. She died because someone gave them the gap. And Marco Fierro has been in this organization for 30 years and had access to route security and was in that car with me afterward, which means... She stopped. Which means he's been inside for longer than we knew, Damiano said. Which means, Serena said, that everything I've been told about that night, about my father's response, about why my father went underground. All of it was filtered through an organization with a man inside it who was reporting to our enemies. She looked at him. What else was filtered, Damiano? He didn't answer immediately. Is my father alive? We believe... Is my father alive? Yes, Damiano said. But where he's being held... Tell me everything, Serena said. Not the version you decided I was ready for. Everything you actually know. Damiano pulled out the chair beside him and sat down heavily. And for the first time since Serena had known him, since she was 13 years old and he was 28 and already carrying the weight of the organization on a frame that looked too young for it, he looked tired. He began to talk. And as he talked, Serena sat across from him and listened, and the story that came out was not the story she had been told. It was older and more broken and full of decisions made by frightened men under impossible pressure, and at its center, where the truth had always been, was a man she loved, being held in a place she hadn't known existed by people who had spent 20 years making sure she never found out. By the time Damiano finished, it was past 2 in the afternoon. Serena sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Get Marco out of the holding room. I want to talk to him." Damiano looked at her. "Serena, not to hurt him," she said. "I want to ask him one question." She stood. "I want to know if my father knew, if he understood before they took him, that the man he trusted was the one who opened the door." She picked up the folder in front of her and closed it with a precise, controlled motion. "Because if he knew, if my father went into that fortress knowing Marco betrayed him and stayed silent about it, then there's information inside that compound that changes everything we think we're walking into." She moved toward the door. "And we are walking into it," she said without turning. "Start planning." Damiano watched her go. Outside in the hallway, her hands, which had been still throughout the entire conversation, shook once, a single involuntary tremor, gone as quickly as it came, and then were still again. She kept walking. Marco Fierro was 61 years old and had the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades doing difficult things with them. He sat in the chair they'd put him in, not restrained, which was either a gesture of residual respect or a calculated signal that restraint wasn't necessary because there was nowhere to go. And he looked at the wall opposite him with the stillness of someone who had already finished the internal argument and arrived at whatever was on the other side of it. He heard the door open. He didn't look. He heard her footsteps cross the room. He knew her walk, had known it since she was a child, learning to move quietly through corridors that weren't safe. When he had told her, that the way you walked announced you before you spoke, and she had practiced until she could cross a marble floor without a sound. She sat down across from him and said nothing. He looked at her then. Her face was the thing that cost him. Not her anger. He'd prepared for anger, had been stealing for it since the moment Damiano's men came for him at 6 in the morning, and he understood that the timeline had collapsed. What he hadn't prepared for was the absence of it. She looked at him the way you look at a landscape after something has burned through it, not the fire itself. The after. "How long?" she said. Marco said, "Serena, how long?" He held her gaze. He owed her that much, he supposed. He owed her eyes to look into when he answered. 23 years. She absorbed that without moving. 23 years. She'd been 10 years old 23 years ago. Somewhere in the math of that, the fire that killed her mother was 3 years away from wherever he'd started. "Before my mother died," she said. "Yes." "You were already reporting to the Romero organization when you told us the route was secure." He said nothing, which was its own answer. "Look at me," she said. He was looking at her. "Did you tell them where the gap was?" The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. He felt it on his chest. He'd felt things on his chest for 23 years and had learned to breathe through them, and he breathed through this one too. "Yes," he said. Serena sat back in her chair. Her hands were on the table in front of her, flat, still. He watched her fingers. They didn't curl, they didn't tighten. They stayed open, which he understood, in the way that you understand things about people you've watched for 20 years, was the hardest version of this for her. The controlled version, the version she was choosing. "Why?" she said. "It's a long..." "Don't." Her voice didn't change volume. "Don't tell me it's complicated. Don't tell me I wouldn't understand. Give me the reason. One sentence." Marco looked at his own hands. Your father made a decision in 1998 that cost the Romero organization $40 million and 3 of their senior people. And he made it without telling anyone in his own structure. And 2 men in our organization at the time decided the cost was too high and approached the Romeros about a long-term arrangement. He paused. I was one of them. Who was the other? He looked up. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance exactly, more like a man measuring the remaining distance to the end of something and deciding to walk it straight. Victor Ashcroft, he said. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Serena looked at him for a long time. Victor Ashcroft, the Moretti family's attorney for 30 years, the man who had drafted her father's last known legal documents, the man who had managed the estate during her father's disappearance, who had been, as far as anyone in the organization's legitimate structure knew, the most trusted non-family member in the dynasty's history. Victor, she said. He was the architect, Marco said. I was the instrument. You carried me out of that safe house. Yes. After my mother was dead, after the attack you'd told them how to make. His voice stayed flat. You held me for 6 hours. Yes. Why didn't you just let them take me? Something finally moved in his face. Not guilt. It was past guilt, past the place where that word meant anything, but something older and uglier and more honest. Because that wasn't the arrangement. The arrangement was your mother, not you, not yet. He stopped. Victor wanted you alive. He said you were the lever, that a dead heir was useless, but a living one, placed correctly, could be used later. He placed me, Serena said slowly. He placed me with Elias. Not directly, the arrangement through Voss in the introduction. That was Victor's design. 11 years of patience. Marco's voice was tired now, the tiredness of a man describing something he has been carrying so long, the weight has become posture. He let you have your quiet life for 7 years, long enough that you'd built habits of peace, long enough that you'd stopped checking exits. He paused. Then Voss went to work on Mercer, and the rest followed the way Victor designed it. Serena stood up. She walked to the window. The harbor was visible from here too, the Sovereign at the pier, steady and lit, surrounded by water that looked gray and cold. Where's Victor Ashcroft now? She said. He has a compound, on an island off the Louisiana coast, privately held, incorporated through 4 shell entities that I helped him establish in 2009. Marco said it without drama. He's been there for 3 months, since the operation went active. And my father is there. Yes. She turned from the window. You know this for certain. I've known for 11 months, Marco said. I was the one who facilitated the transfer. The room was very, very quiet. You moved my father, Serena said, to Victor's compound. I told Victor when your father's previous location was going to be accessed by the Damiano's team for a welfare check. Victor moved him before they arrived. He met her eyes. Your father has been in that compound for 11 months. I don't know his condition. I wasn't given that information. Serena crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped in front of him. And for a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, the controlled stillness broke, and what was underneath it was not anger, not grief, but something older and more fundamental, the look of someone recalculating every memory they've built a self on and finding the arithmetic is wrong. Then it sealed back over. You're going to draw me a map, she said. Every structure on that compound you know of, every security protocol you helped design, every communication channel between Victor and his Romero contacts. Serena, you're going to do this because the alternative is that I walk out of this room and Damiano decides what happens next, and Damiano doesn't have the same interest I do in keeping you useful. She said it without theater. You've been a weapon for the wrong side for 23 years. You're going to spend the next several hours being useful to the right one. Marco Fierro looked at the woman across from him, the 10-year-old he'd carried through smoke, the 13-year-old he'd sat with in the back of an armored car, the grown woman who had just heard that he'd helped destroy her family and was now asking him to help repair it with the same steady voice. And he said, "All right." She pulled out the chair and sat back down. Petra came in with paper and a tablet. Marco began to draw. He talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Serena sat across from him the entire time. She asked precise questions. She didn't flinch at the answers. She made him go back twice when the layout of the eastern structure didn't reconcile with what Damiano's intelligence team had recovered from satellite imagery, and Marco corrected himself without being defensive about it, and they kept going. At the end of it, Serena stood. Marco said, "Your father, the last time I saw him, he was standing. He stopped. He's not broken. Whatever else Victor has done, he hasn't broken him. I think Victor needs him thinking clearly, needs him to understand what's happening to the organization." Serena looked at him. "I'm not telling you this to make what I did smaller," Marco said. "I know what I did." "Good," she said, and she walked out. She was in the hallway for 12 steps before she stopped, turned to the wall, and put her forehead against it. Just for a moment. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was working at something. Then she straightened and kept walking. Damiano was waiting in the main conference room with 4 members of the tactical team and the head of the intelligence division, a quiet man named Hess, who looked like an accountant and thought like a siege engineer. They had the satellite imagery up. They had tide charts and weather projections and the preliminary assessment of what a naval approach to the compound's island would require. They had not, until Marco's session, had interior schematics. Serena laid the drawings on the table. Damiano looked at them, then at her. "He gave you all of this?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he's been holding it for 23 years, and the weight of it has been the only company he had." She said it without sympathy, just as an observation about human architecture. People carry secrets because secrets are power, and when the power is gone, the secret is just weight. She flattened the drawing with both hands. He wanted to put it down. Hess leaned over the table and studied the drawings in silence for 30 seconds. Then he started pointing. "If this eastern access corridor is accurate, the approach window from the water is significantly wider than we calculated. The defensive coverage has a gap between the 2 northern towers." The door to the conference room opened. It was one of the floor security team, a young man named Castillo who had been with the Sovereign crew for 2 years, and whose face Serena had learned because she made it her business to learn the faces of people responsible for the space around her. Castillo's face right now was the face of someone delivering information they wish they weren't delivering. "There's a situation," Castillo said, "at the front of the hotel." "What kind?" Damiano said. "Federal, 4 vehicles. They're asking for access to the building. They have—" Castillo glanced at Serena. "They have Elias Mercer with them." The room shifted. Not physically, but the attention in it redirected with the precision of a compass finding north. Serena said, "He's in custody?" "No, he came with them voluntarily. Castillo's jaw worked briefly. "He's been talking to them, Ms. Vale, for the past 3 hours, from what we can tell. A federal task force. The names on the credentials are DOJ and Treasury." Serena looked at Damiano. Damiano's face had closed down into something flat and cold and very focused. "He went to the government." "He went to the government," Serena said. "After you met with him this morning, after we discussed—" "I know what we discussed," she said quietly. Petra appeared at Serena's shoulder. Her voice was low. "If Mercer told them about the proxy funds, if he gave them the structure of your investment positions in his company, that's a financial disclosure that could freeze our domestic assets within—" "I know," Serena said. "And if he gave them the context of your conversation this morning—" "I know, Petra." Damiano said, "I told you not to meet with him." Serena turned. "You told me to route his call through security." "Which means the same thing." "It doesn't, and you know it doesn't." Her voice was level. "He came to me. He told me about Carano's approach. He gave me information we needed. And in exchange," Damiano said, "you gave him enough to walk into a federal building and give them a thread that leads directly to this floor." His voice wasn't raised. It was more controlled than raised, which for Damiano was more serious. "He's not an asset, Serena. He was never an asset. He's a man who felt humiliated and saw an opportunity to feel less so by becoming relevant to powerful people, and you let him." The truth of it hit somewhere she didn't show. Downstairs in the hotel lobby, Elias Mercer stood next to a federal agent named Delaney, who had a calm face and a recorder on her hip, and who had spent the last 3 hours listening to everything Elias knew, which was more than he'd realized he knew once he started talking, the way confessions sometimes work. More than he'd planned to give, But once the shape of his own ignorance became clear, the information had kept coming because he'd needed someone to tell it to, and Delaney had been there with coffee and the patient attention of someone paid to listen. He hadn't thought clearly about what happened next. He'd thought about Carano's offer. He'd thought about the drive on the table and the $62 million and the collapsing company, and he'd thought about Serena's face in that hotel room, the way she'd described the proxy funds like reading a receipt, and he'd understood, or believed he understood, that he was a man standing at the intersection of people who were larger than him in every direction, and that the only leverage he had was what he knew and who he was willing to tell it to. He hadn't thought about what it would cost her. He was thinking about it now, standing in the lobby while Delaney made a call, watching the elevator panel, and wondering if she already knew, which of course she did, these people always knew, and feeling the specific nausea of a decision you can't walk back. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it. A voice he didn't recognize said, "Mr. Mercer, my name is Victor Ashcroft. I think it's time we spoke directly." Elias went very still. "You've had a complicated 24 hours, Ashcroft said. The voice was older, 70, maybe, with the modulated calm of a man who'd spent his life being paid to sound unrattled. You've spoken to Carano, to Serena, and now to the federal government. You're trying to find the position that makes you safest. I understand that impulse entirely." "Who are you?" Elias said, though he knew the name. He'd heard it from Serena's face, if not her mouth, in the conference room, the way she'd received it. "I'm the person who designed the last 4 years of your life," Ashcroft said. "I think that earns me a few minutes of your attention." A pause. "I also have something you're going to want. Your federal friends downstairs are working from the information you gave them, which is useful but incomplete. Without what I'm prepared to offer you, the case they build leads back to the Moretti organization, but not past it. The man who actually orchestrated everything, including the death of Serena's mother, remains invisible." Another pause. "Don't you think she deserves to know the full truth?" Elias turned away from the lobby, lowered his voice. "What do you want?" "I want you to go back upstairs," Ashcroft said. "Tell Serena that you have something. Don't tell her from whom. Bring her to the conversation." His voice was comfortable, patient. The voice of a man who had run this play before. "She won't come if she knows it's me, but she'll come if it's you asking. You want me to bring her to you?" "I want to offer her something she can't get any other way," Ashcroft said. "The location of her father, the full record of what happened to her mother, and a way out of the next 72 hours that doesn't end with half the people she cares about dead." A beat. "I'm not asking you to betray her. I'm asking you to give her a choice she doesn't currently have." The lobby was quiet around Elias. Delaney was 20 feet away, still on her call, turned partly away. "If I do this," Elias said, "and she gets hurt, then you'll have made a choice with consequences. Like everyone in this story." Ashcroft's voice didn't change. "You've been making choices with consequences since you signed those papers 3 days ago. The difference now is you're doing it with some awareness of the terrain." A pause. "Get her to a phone. That's all I need. One conversation." The line went dead. Elias stood in the lobby of the Alderman Hotel with his phone in his hand, and Agent Delaney 20 feet away and 7 floors of Moretti security above him, and the specific cold clarity of a man who has just been handed a choice that has no clean option in any direction. He thought about Serena in the hotel room, the way she'd said, "Because I was your wife," like she was closing a drawer that had been left open too long. He thought about the drive Carano had put on the table, the easy path, the one he'd already turned away from once. He thought about Ashcroft's voice, its patience, its comfort, the way it had shaped the offer to sound like care. He pressed the elevator button. Delaney turned and saw him moving. "Mr. Mercer." "I need 5 minutes," he said. "Sir, I'd advise you not to—" The elevator opened. He got in. The doors closed. On the top floor, when the elevator opened and Castillo saw him step out, the bodyguard's hand moved to his jacket, with the instinctive preparedness of someone who had already been briefed that Elias Mercer had spent the afternoon talking to federal agents. "I need to see Serena," Elias said. "Sir, that's not—" "Tell her I have something," Elias said. "Tell her someone contacted me, someone who says he has her father's location." He held Castillo's gaze. "Tell her that, and let her decide." Castillo looked at him for 3 long seconds. Then he touched his earpiece and repeated the message into it word for word. 30 seconds passed. The conference room door opened. Serena stood in the doorway. Behind her, Damiano was already rising from his chair. Her eyes found Elias. "Who contacted you?" she said. Elias opened his mouth to answer, and that was when the first explosion hit the harbor. A deep, resonant percussion that moved through the building's structure, rattling the windows on the seaward side, followed immediately by the muffled crack of smaller detonations in sequence, and then the unmistakable sound carried on the harbor wind of automatic weapons fire. Everyone moved at once. Hess was already at the window. "The Sovereign," he said. His voice had gone completely flat. "They're hitting the Sovereign." Serena crossed the room in 4 steps and looked. The flagship, her ship, the vessel that had carried her home, that bore her family's crest on its bow, was under coordinated assault from 3 directions. Small fast craft coming in from the north and east, armed men rappelling from a helicopter that had appeared over the harbor's southeastern approach. The escort vessels were returning fire. The pier security had engaged, but the attack had begun at multiple points simultaneously, which meant it had been planned for this moment, this night, this window, when the Moretti organization was concentrated in a single building and the ship was docked, and the full force of the organization's tactical capacity was tied up managing the hotel's security perimeter. Serena looked at the harbor for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned to Damiano. "They knew we were here," she said. "They knew our position, our concentration, the ship's docking schedule." Her voice was absolutely level. "Someone inside this room, or someone with access to what was discussed in this room, told them when to move." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms permanently. Every perfect recalibration that happens when trust becomes a question rather than an assumption. Damiano's eyes moved to Elias. Elias held up both hands. "I was downstairs with federal agents. I didn't make any calls. Check your phone," Damiano said, and the 2 men nearest Elias moved without being told. "I received a call," Elias said, not resisting as they took his phone. "From Victor Ashcroft. He called me. I didn't call him." The name hit the room like something physical. Serena turned very slowly. "He called you," she said. "Victor Ashcroft called your phone." "Yes." "When?" 4 minutes ago. In the lobby." 4 minutes ago. Serena looked at Damiano and saw him doing the same arithmetic. 4 minutes ago, Ashcroft had called Elias's phone. A phone that had been in a hotel lobby with federal agents 20 feet away. A phone connected to a network that the federal task force had almost certainly been monitoring since Elias walked into their building 3 hours ago. "He used you to triangulate," Serena said. Her voice was very quiet. "Your phone, the federal signal, our building's address." She looked at Elias with something that wasn't anger. It was past anger, past whatever she'd had for him before, into something colder and more fundamental. "He's been tracking you since this morning, since you left here. He used your position to pinpoint ours, and he timed the assault to begin while you were back in this room, so the response would be..." Another explosion from the harbor, closer. "We need to move," Hess said. "Now. If they've identified the building..." "They've identified the building," Damiano said. "Get everyone to the lower level. Security Protocol 7. Now." The room fractured into urgent motion. Petra was already on a radio. The tactical team was pulling equipment. Castillo and 2 others were clearing the corridor. Serena stood in the middle of the controlled chaos and looked at Elias. He looked back at her. There was nothing to say that would fix what had just happened. He could see that she knew this. He could see that she was not going to say it because there was no time, and because saying it would not change the shape of the next few hours, and because Serena Vale had learned, in a life that had required the lesson repeatedly, that recrimination was a luxury that situations like this could not afford. What she said instead was, "Stay close to Petra. Do not make any calls. Do not speak to Delaney or anyone from the federal team without telling me first." She said it with the clipped economy of someone issuing instructions under fire. "If we get separated, do not go looking for me. Do not try to help. Stay where Petra puts you and wait." "Serena." "Not now," she said. She turned and walked toward the door. In the harbor below, the Sovereign was burning at the bow, and her crew was fighting back with everything they had. And somewhere on a compound off the Louisiana coast, a man named Victor Ashcroft was watching a monitor and seeing exactly what he'd engineered, the last Moretti heir, flushed from cover, her organization fractured, her ship under assault, her position exposed, and a city full of people about to watch something that would make her impossible to hide again. He had been patient for 23 years. The waiting was over. And Serena Vale, descending through a stairwell with a gun she hadn't carried in 4 years now, in her right hand and the sound of her own heartbeat deliberate in her ears, understood that the woman who had signed divorce papers 3 days ago, with her eyes down and walked away without a word, was someone she was never going to be able to go back to. That version of herself had been the safest thing she'd ever built. Victor had just burned it to the ground, and she was going to make him pay for every ash. The stairwell smelled like concrete and the specific cold of a building that had been sealed tight against the outside world, and Serena moved through it with the gun at low ready, and Petra 2 steps behind her and Castillo ahead, clearing each landing before they committed to it. 4 floors down, the sound of the harbor was still audible through the building's structure. Not as noise exactly, but as vibration, the deep thud of secondary explosions transmitting through steel and concrete like a pulse in the walls. Serena counted them without meaning to. 3 large, several smaller. The smaller ones were the escort vessels returning fire. The large ones were incoming. On the 6th floor landing, Castillo stopped and held up a fist. Everyone stopped. He was listening. Below them, 2 floors down, something had changed in the ambient sound of the stairwell. Not a voice. Not footsteps exactly. More like the specific quality of air in an enclosed space when it's being moved by people who are trying not to be heard. Serena looked at Petra. Petra had already shifted to the wall, presenting the smallest possible profile. Elias, 3 steps behind Serena, was breathing too loud. She didn't look at him, but she heard it. The uncontrolled breathing of someone whose body was running ahead of their training, because he had no training, because he was an executive in a stairwell with a gun battle in the harbor outside, and men on the floors below who were not hotel security. She reached back without looking and put one hand flat on his chest. A single gesture. Stop. Be still. Breathe through your nose. He did. She felt it through her palm. The effort of it, the deliberate slowing. Whatever else she thought about him right now, she noted the compliance. He was listening. That was something. Castillo eased forward to the stairwell door on the 6th floor, cracked it, looked through for 3 seconds, and pulled back. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed down the corridor, then drew a slow horizontal line with his finger. Serena read it. 2 people, in the hall, stationary, waiting. They hadn't come in from outside. They'd come from inside the building, which meant they'd been placed before the assault began, before the Sovereign was hit, positioned and waiting for the moment the top-floor security team would move their principal through the building's core. Victor had people inside the hotel. Serena processed this in approximately 1 second, because the implications cascaded immediately. If there were 2 in the 6th-floor corridor, there were more elsewhere. The lobby was compromised. The parking structure below was compromised. The federal agents, Delaney and her team, were either contained, complicit, or caught in something they hadn't anticipated. There was no clean exit from this building through any route they'd planned. She made a decision. She leaned to Castillo and said directly into his ear, 4 words: up, roof, the bird. He looked at her. She looked back. He nodded once. They went up. The Moretti organization maintained, as a matter of operational standard, a helicopter on retainer at every location where the principal operated for more than 24 hours. In Charleston, this was a private aviation company that asked no questions because they had been paid a very great deal of money for many years in exchange for not asking questions. The helicopter was on the alderman's roof pad, had been there since yesterday morning, fueled and ready, because Damiano's operational protocols required it. What they didn't know, until Castillo cracked the roof access door and immediately pulled it shut again with enough force that Serena felt the air pressure change on her face, was whether the roof was clear. 2 shooters, Castillo said. His voice had gone to nothing, lip movement and breath. Northeast corner, covering the pad. Serena thought for exactly 2 seconds. She looked at Petra. Damiano's team. Where are they? Petra had her earpiece in, had been trying to raise Damiano's channel since the 4th floor. She shook her head. Jammed. Whatever they're running, it's blocking the secure frequency. They had communications interference, a compromised lobby, hostile positions on the roof, and an unknown number of embedded operatives in the building's interior. Serena turned to Elias. He was pressed against the stairwell wall, jacket damp at the collar, watching her with the focused attention of someone who has understood that the only useful thing they can do in this moment is not get in the way. "Your phone," she said. "Ashcroft called you on it." "Yes." "He has that number." "Yes." "Call him back." Elias stared at her. "What?" "Call him back. Tell him you're on the roof. Tell him you have me. Tell him whatever you need to say to make him pull the shooters off the pad for 60 seconds. She held his gaze. "He wants me alive. He said as much. If he thinks you've delivered me to the roof, he'll redirect his people. And if he doesn't believe me, then we find out fast," she said. Elias took a breath, took his phone. Castillo watched him the way a man watches a piece of equipment he doesn't trust. Elias called the number. It rang once. Ashcroft answered. "I wondered how long." "I have her," Elias said. His voice was steadier than Serena expected. "Roof access. I convinced her it was the only way out. She thinks I'm helping her." A pause. "Call off the roof. If your people shoot her, this ends before it starts." A silence on the other end that lasted long enough for Serena to feel her own pulse in her jaw. "You've surprised me, Mr. Mercer," Ashcroft said. "I didn't think you had this in you." "Call them off." Another silence. Then, "You have 90 seconds. After that, my people need to secure the pad regardless. Bring her down through the north door. There'll be a vehicle." The line went dead. Serena was already moving. She took the roof door hard. Castillo through first, and they covered the distance to the helicopter in 11 seconds across open rooftop, with the harbor fire painting the eastern sky orange and the wind off the water cutting through everything. The two shooters who'd been on the northeast corner were gone, redirected, pulled, complying with Ashcroft's instruction. And the helicopter pilot, a compact woman named Rains who had been flying for the Moretti organization for 7 years, and whose expression when she saw them coming suggested she had already assessed the situation and started her pre-flight, was in the cockpit with the rotors beginning to turn. They loaded. Petra first, then Elias, then Serena last, who stopped at the door and looked back at the rooftop for one moment. The harbor below, the Sovereign burning at the bow but still fighting, the city that had held her quietly for 4 years spread out below her, the lights of it. Then she got in. The helicopter lifted. Below them, on the roof, the two shooters reappeared at the northeast corner. They looked up. One of them raised his weapon and then didn't fire. The helicopter was already at 100 feet and climbing, and the instruction had been to deliver, not destroy. Ashcroft would know in approximately 60 seconds that he'd been played. Serena had 60 seconds. "Rains," she said into the headset. "Already heading south," Rains said. "Where am I going?" "Louisiana coast. I'll give you coordinates in 5 minutes." In the left seat, Elias had found the helicopter's secondary headset and plugged in. He was looking at her across the cockpit. "You knew he'd pull them," he said. "I thought he would." "That's not the same as knowing." "No," she said. "It isn't." The harbor fell away below them, and Charleston became a map, and then a coastline, and then they were over water with the night sky above them. And Serena pulled out the drawings Marco had made and spread them across her knee in the cramped space of the helicopter and began to memorize what she hadn't already memorized because there was no longer a planning session to get back to. There was only this. 40 minutes south-southeast as the Louisiana coast began to resolve out of the dark water below, Petra managed to restore a signal through the helicopter's satellite uplink and raise Damiano. His voice, when it came through, was compressed and tight with the specific tension of a man managing a firefight. "Where are you?" "Inbound to the target," Serena said. 20 minutes out." "You're doing what?" Not a question, an attempt to process. "The compound, Marco's drawings. We have the interior layout and the approach window." She looked at the coastline below. "What's the status of the Sovereign?" "Holding. We pushed the assault craft back. 2 of theirs sank, 1 disabled. We have casualties. Serena, we are not in a position to mount a coordinated—" "I'm not asking for coordination," she said. "I need you to send 1 fast boat south, 2 of your best people. Meet me at the secondary access point Marco marked on the eastern side." "That's a suicide approach. It's the only approach Victor hasn't planned for," she said. "He designed this whole night to have me running. He doesn't expect me to move toward him." She pressed 2 fingers against the cold window beside her and looked at the darkness of the water below. "Get me a boat, Damiano." A silence. The sound of the helicopter, the sound of the harbor battle, faint and distant through the connection. "The boat will be there," Damiano said. "Don't do anything until it arrives." She didn't answer that. The helicopter set down on a strip of private shoreline that Rains found by coordinates Serena had given her from Marco's drawings, a maintenance access point on the island's northeastern face, outside the camera coverage of the compound's primary security system. The landing was rough, soft ground, the rotors kicking up grass and salt marsh debris, and the moment the skids touched, Serena was out and moving toward the waterline. The boat arrived 9 minutes later, a low, dark craft running without lights. 2 of Damiano's people aboard, a man named Solis, who Serena had worked with twice before, and who said nothing when he saw her except "Southwest approach is clear," and handed her a tactical vest and a second weapon. She put the vest on, checked the weapon. Her hands knew what they were doing. She was aware of this distantly, the way the muscle memory inhabited her body like a language she'd stopped speaking and had just been reminded she still knew. Elias was still on the shoreline. She hadn't told him to come. She also hadn't told him to stay. He walked to the boat. She looked at him. "I'm not an asset," he said. "I know that. But I know Ashcroft's voice and I know what he wants from me, and that might be useful once we're inside," Petra said from behind Serena's shoulder. "He's not wrong." Serena looked at Elias for 3 seconds. "You stay behind Solis. You do exactly what he says. If he tells you to get on the ground, you get on the ground and you don't ask why." "Okay. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to—" "If something happens to me," she said again sharply, "you get out. You go back to the boat with Rains and you get out. You don't try to finish anything. You don't try to find my father. You leave." She held his gaze until she saw the compliance in it. "Say you understand." "I understand," he said. They went. The compound's eastern perimeter was a concrete wall topped with razor line that looked, from the water, like exactly what it was: the edge of a place that had been built to keep things in as much as out. Marco's drawings had marked 2 blind spots in the surveillance coverage, places where the camera arcs didn't fully overlap, legacy gaps from when the compound had been expanded and the security system hadn't been fully recalibrated. They went through the northern gap. Solis cut the razor line with equipment that said this wasn't his first time through a perimeter in the dark. The second of Damiano's people, a woman named Torres whose face Serena didn't know, took the southern side and waited. Inside the wall, the compound was larger than the drawings had suggested and more inhabited than intelligence had indicated. There were lights in 3 of the structures, movement visible through windows. The count of armed personnel Marco had given them, 12 to 15, felt as Serena crouched in the shadow of the outer building and watched a 2-man patrol complete their circuit, like it might be conservative. She counted what she could see. 9 in visible rotation, which meant more inside. She adjusted. They moved through the compound's shadow corridors, the gaps between structures that the lighting design had missed, the places where a person who knew the layout could transit without crossing open ground. Serena moved the way she hadn't moved in 4 years, the way she'd spent 4 years pretending she didn't know how to move, and it came back completely, and it didn't feel like coming home. It felt like putting on clothing she'd stored in the back of a closet because she'd hoped she wouldn't need it again. She'd needed it. They reached the central structure, the main building, 3 stories, the one Marco had identified as the detention facility, when the patrol rotation caught them, not because of a mistake, because the patrol had been changed, modified from the schedule Marco had described. Someone, Ashcroft, working from the information that the Charleston operation had not delivered Serena as planned, had tightened the security interval. The patrol guard came around the building's corner and had approximately 1 second to register the 3 people pressed against the wall before Solis moved. It was fast and quiet, and the guard went down without firing, but the radio on his hip had already transmitted the carrier tone that indicated he'd keyed it. Not words, just the electronic equivalent of a hand raised. And somewhere in the compound's security center, someone had just received a signal that a patrol had broken schedule. "We have 90 seconds, Solis said. He wasn't breathing hard. His voice was the flat professional calm of someone who had already moved to the next problem. They went through this building's side door, Marco had provided the access code, which still worked, which told Serena that Victor was either supremely confident or hadn't imagined Marco would give her this, and into the interior. The building smelled like climate-controlled air and the particular sterility of a space that had been designed to be livable but not comfortable. Corridors, numbered doors, overhead lighting at emergency levels. The kind of place that had been arranged for function, not appearance. They went down. The lower level was where Marco had said the detention rooms were, and Serena moved through the lower corridor with her weapon up and her breathing measured and her mind on the door at the end of the hall that Marco had marked with a circle on his drawing and said, without drama, was the room where her father had been held since November. She reached the door. There was a keypad. Marco had given her a code. She entered it. The lock released. She pushed the door open. The room was 10 feet by 12 feet, well lit, with a cot and a table and the minimal arrangements of a long-term detention that had been designed to maintain rather than punish. A man was seated at the table with his back to the door, writing something by hand on paper, and the posture of him, the set of his shoulders, the particular angle of his head, hit Serena below the level of language, below the level of thought, in the place where 20 years of absence hadn't managed to touch the original registration of a person. "Papa," she said. Enzo Vale turned around. He was older, 71 now, to the 61 she'd last seen. The 11 months in this room had taken something from him that wasn't visible in any specific feature, but was present in the aggregate, the way a house reads as empty even when the furniture is still there. But his eyes, when they found her face, were the eyes she remembered, and they were clear, and they were present. He stood up. He didn't say anything. He crossed the room and put both hands on her face the way a man confirms something he's afraid to believe. And Serena let him, and for exactly 4 seconds, the room was only that. Then Solis said, from the doorway, "We need to move. Now." They moved. Enzo was slower than Serena had hoped. Not incapacitated, but 11 months of limited movement had done what it always did, and she put one hand under his arm, and they went up the corridor at the pace he could manage, which was faster than expected because he was, whatever else, her father's son, which meant her father's daughter, which meant something about what the family was built from. They were 6 meters from the stairwell door when the lights went out. Not emergency reduction. Complete dark, building wide. The kind of blackout that has been triggered deliberately, and that means someone in the security center has made a decision about how to handle the breach. Solis had a light out within 2 seconds. Serena had her hand on Enzo's arm, and Elias was directly behind her, and Petra was covering the rear, and they went for the door in the harsh beam of the tactical light. The door opened. Victor Ashcroft was standing at the top of the stairs. He was not what Serena had built him into in the last several hours. I was 70 years old, and he was lean, and he wore a suit that fit him well, and he held a weapon with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to use one early and never stopped. Behind him were 2 armed men. And behind them, just visible at the top of the stairwell, was Felix Carano, who looked at Serena with an expression that contained nothing, no triumph, no apology, nothing, and then looked away. Victor said, "Serena, I've been waiting for you since your mother died." His voice was exactly as it had been on the phone, unhurried, modulated, the voice of a man who had been the most trusted person in a room for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. "I know," Serena said. "You found Marco's drawings." He glanced past her at the corridor. "And you brought your father out. I expected that too. I expected all of this, including the helicopter and the eastern approach." He tilted his head slightly. "What I didn't expect was Elias." He looked at Elias. Something moved in his face, something that was almost, in the worst way, avuncular. "You're not what I designed for," Victor said to Elias. "I designed you to be gone by now, used and discarded. The fact that you're here, with her, in this building." He almost smiled. "That's the only genuine surprise of the evening." Elias said nothing. "What do you want, Victor?" Serena said. Her voice was flat and even and gave him nothing. "The same thing I've always wanted," he said. "The organization, your father's seat, the full transfer of the Moretti structure to new management." He looked at her calmly. "I built it, Serena. I built more of it than your father ever acknowledged. I spent 30 years making it what it is while your family took the credit and the royalties, and when I finally told your father what I deserved..." "He said no," Serena said. "He said no," Victor agreed. And then he moved to have me removed, which was a pause. Short-sighted. So you had my mother killed. I had the leverage required to ensure your father understood the consequences of poor decisions. His voice didn't change. He said it like a budget line. Your mother was a consequence. Serena's hand tightened on the weapon she had not yet raised. Her father, beside her, was very still. She could feel the rigidity of him through the hand she had on his arm. Not fear, not grief, something older and more combustible than either of those things. Don't, she said quietly to her father. Enzo said nothing. Victor looked at them both with the patience of a man who has held a position of superiority long enough to find other people's responses. Academic. You have a simple choice, he said. Your father signs the transfer documents. Yes, I have them. Yes, they're here. And yes, they're legally valid. I drafted them. I know what holds up. And you both walk out of here tonight. Or what? Serena said. He looked at her steadily. Or neither of you does. The stairwell was very quiet. Serena looked at Victor Ashcroft, at the face of the man who had ended her mother, exiled her father, dismantled her life piece by piece, with the patience of someone who considered decades a reasonable investment, and who was now standing 6 feet from her with 2 armed men behind him, and the presumption of a man who had not yet fully understood what he was standing across from. She raised the weapon. He raised his. Behind him, the 2 armed men brought their weapons up, and Carano stepped back, and the stairwell held everything in perfect, terrible suspension. And then Elias Mercer, standing behind Serena and to her left, said clearly into the silence, Ashcroft, your financial network. Victor's eyes moved to him. I gave the Treasury team everything, Elias said. Voss's records, the proxy structures, the shell entities in Louisiana, the 4 that Marco helped you establish in 2009. He held Victor's gaze. I gave them the account names and the jurisdiction records and the communication logs that Serena's people pulled from the Moretti internal network. A pause. How long does it take to freeze an international financial network once Treasury has that documentation? Something moved in Victor's face, the first crack in the modulation. 72 hours, Elias said. Maybe less. How long have we been in this building? The 2 armed men behind Victor exchanged a look that Victor couldn't see, but Serena could. It's done, Elias said. Whatever you are going to do tonight, the financial structure that funds it is already burning. Your people know that. Carano knows that. Carano, behind the 2 guards, was looking at Victor with an expression that had changed. Victor said to Carano, without turning, Stand your ground. Carano didn't move, but he didn't raise his weapon either. Victor's jaw was tight. The weapon in his hand was steady. He had that much control. But something behind his eyes was running the numbers that Elias had just put on the table and not finding the result he wanted. Serena kept her weapon up and her breathing even and watched Victor Ashcroft understand in real time that the thing he'd built with 30 years of patience had just been named and frozen and handed to people who would spend the next decade dismantling it, and that the move he'd planned for tonight, the capstone, the transfer of power, the culmination, had been outflanked not by the woman he'd spent 2 decades planning against, but by the ordinary, imperfect, previously irrelevant man standing behind her. Victor looked at Serena. She looked back. Drop it, she said. His weapon hand trembled once, a single involuntary movement, the body betraying what the mind was refusing. And then Victor Ashcroft, the man who had destroyed her family with 30 years of patient architecture, looked at the gun she was holding and at the face behind it, and understood that he had been wrong about her the same way everyone had been wrong about her. He had seen the quiet and called it weakness, and he was only now, at the end of everything, beginning to understand what it had actually been. He lowered his weapon 2 inches. Behind him, the first guard put his down. The second guard was still holding his, still assessing, his eyes moving between Victor and Serena and the math of the room when the building's emergency lighting came back on. And with it, from the stairwell above, the sound of boots on concrete, multiple sets, moving fast, and Damiano Moretti's voice saying something clipped and definitive to someone at the top of the stairs. The second guard put his weapon down. Victor Ashcroft stood in the middle of the stairwell with his weapon half raised and his financial empire already collapsing in the servers of federal buildings he would never see the inside of, and he looked at Serena Vale, and the thing in his face was not quite the expression of a man who is lost. because losing implies the possibility of the other outcome. And this was something beyond losing. This was the expression of a man who has just understood that the story was never the story he thought he was telling. Serena walked up the stairs toward him. She stopped one step below him, which put them at eye level. "My father walked into this compound," she said quietly, "because someone he trusted opened the door. My mother died because someone she trusted gave away the route." She looked at him with the clear, still attention of someone who has been preparing for this moment since they were 13 years old and bleeding in the back of a car. "You've been doing this for 30 years because you thought the people around you weren't paying attention." Victor said nothing. "We were paying attention," she said. She stepped past him and continued up the stairs. The compound's upper level was controlled within 4 minutes of Damiano's team coming through the roof access. And it was not clean, and it was not without cost. One of Damiano's men, a young Spaniard named Reyes, who had been with the organization for 3 years and who had a photograph of his daughter taped to the inside of his tactical vest, took a round in the shoulder from the second guard's partner, who had been stationed in the eastern corridor and had not received the message that the financial structure had collapsed and the strategic calculus of the evening had fundamentally changed. Reyes went down hard, and Torres, who was 4 feet behind him, returned fire and ended the exchange. And then she was on the ground beside Reyes with her hands on the wound and saying his name in a low, steady voice while the corridor cleared around them. Serena saw this as she came up the stairs. She stopped beside Torres for 3 seconds, long enough to assess, long enough to meet Reyes's eyes and see that he was conscious and present, and the wound was bad but survivable. And then she kept moving, because stopping was not something the next 10 minutes could afford. Carano was in the main hall, seated on the floor with his back against the wall, and his weapon surrendered and his hands visible. And he watched Serena move past him, with the expression of a man who has been in enough operations to know when one has concluded and what posture to adopt when it has concluded against you. He didn't speak. She didn't look at him directly, but she was aware of him with the peripheral attention of someone who has learned that the people who go quiet fastest in a defeat are sometimes the ones worth watching longest. Victor Ashcroft was being managed by 2 of Damiano's people in the central room, not roughly, but with the impersonal efficiency of people who had been told this individual was a priority asset and that his physical condition on delivery mattered. He had surrendered his weapon on the stairs and had said nothing since. He stood in the center of the room with his hands bound in front of him and his suit jacket still on, and his face arranged into the expression of a man who has decided that the only remaining dignity available to him is composure. Serena walked into the room and stood in front of him. He looked at her. "There's something you haven't asked me," he said. "I've asked you everything I need to know." No. Something shifted in his face. Not the strategic composure, but something underneath it, older. The thing that had been there before he'd learned to cover everything with the smooth surface of professional authority. "You haven't asked me why your father didn't tell you about me, about what I told him, about the conversation we had the night before the attack that killed your mother." Serena went still. Victor watched this. "He knew," Victor said. "Not that I'd arranged it, but that I'd made threats, that I'd told him the consequences of removing me were personal. He knew something was coming, and he chose to move your mother on the existing route rather than changing the schedule, because changing the schedule would have—" He paused. He calculated that visibility was the risk, that a last-minute route change would signal vulnerability. He made a tactical decision. The room was very quiet. "And your mother died inside his tactical decision," Victor said. "I caused it. I arranged the mechanism. But the gap I used it because your father's calculation created it." He held her gaze with something that was not triumph and not apology, but the horrible neutrality of a man who has been carrying a weapon for 30 years and is finally showing it to the person it was always aimed at. "He has never told you this." Serena stood in front of him and let the information move through her without letting it move her, which was the hardest physical thing she had done in a night full of hard physical things. She felt it the way you feel a structural shift, not in one place but everywhere simultaneously, the whole weight redistributed. She said, "You're telling me this because you want me to feel it before you're taken." "I'm telling you this," Victor said, "because you deserve the complete truth, not the version your father could live with giving you. And this version," she said, "happens to redirect a portion of what I feel toward him and away from you." Victor looked at her. You've been managing people for 30 years, she said. I know what information deployed at the right moment looks like. She took one step closer to him. You're going to tell everything you just told me to the investigators. On record. Every decision, every arrangement, every piece of the mechanism. And then it will be verified or it won't. And the truth will be what the evidence shows, not what you choose to put in my hands in this room on this night. She held his gaze. You don't get to be the one who tells me who my father is. Victor said nothing. She turned and walked away from him. In the corridor, she stopped walking and stood still for a moment with her hand flat against the wall. Not for support, but for something to press against, something solid and external, because the inside of her chest was doing something she was not going to let anyone in this building see. Her father was in the room they'd brought him to on the ground floor, a room with a chair and a lamp and a window, modest, the kind of space that had been arranged with the minimum required for a human being to maintain themselves in. Enzo Vale was sitting in the chair when Serena came in, and he looked up when the door opened, and what happened in his face when he saw her was not the performance of relief. It was the real thing, unmanaged, the kind of expression that has been held back for so long that when it finally arrives, it arrives as its own weather system. She sat down across from him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Enzo said, He told you. She looked at her father's face. 71 years old and every year of it visible, and she thought about the man she'd built in her memory during the years she hadn't been able to reach him. The idealized version, the clean version, the father who had been taken rather than the father who had made decisions that cost things. And she let that version go, quietly. The way you release something you've been holding so long, your hand has forgotten it's closed. He told me what he wanted me to know, she said. I want to hear yours. Enzo's jaw worked. He looked at his hands. I made a decision, he said, the night before, about the route. He stopped. I have made many decisions in my life that I believed were correct, and some of them were catastrophically wrong. That one, he stopped again. I have lived inside that one for 20 years. You didn't tell me. No. Why? He looked at her. Because you were 13 years old, and your mother was dead, and the only thing I could give you was a version of what happened that didn't include your father's calculation as one of its components. His voice was steady, in the way that things are steady after they have already broken and been repaired badly and held together through sustained effort. I told myself I was protecting you. For 20 years I told myself that. And now, he held her gaze, now you're sitting across from me in a room where you came to get me, after going through everything you went through tonight to do it, and I think you're owed the truth more than I'm owed comfort. She looked at her father. I made a mistake, he said. I made a mistake, and your mother died inside it, and Victor used the space my mistake created. Both of those things are true at the same time. He paused. That's what I know. That's all I know. The lamp in the room was the only light. Outside, the compound had gone to the controlled activity of a secured site. Damiano's people moving through it systematically, Hess managing the documentation, Torres's voice in the corridor, giving someone updates on Reyes. The sounds of aftermath. Serena said, Were you protecting me or protecting yourself? Enzo looked at her. The question sat between them, honest and immovable. Both, he said. I think both. And I think for 20 years I didn't let myself know which one was larger. She nodded slowly. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said. I know. I'm not going to tell you I understand it. I know. But I'm going to tell you... She stopped, found the thing she meant. You're here. I came and you're here and you're talking to me and telling me the truth, even when it costs you. And that's... She looked at her hands. That's something I have to start from. Enzo reached across the space between them and put one hand over hers. She let him. Outside the window, the first gray of early morning was beginning to show above the water. The federal component arrived 3 hours later. Not Delaney's task force, which had been managing the situation in Charleston, but a larger interagency team that had been coordinating with the Treasury Operation Elias had set in motion, and that had been, apparently, waiting for a location on the compound's island before they could move. They arrived in 4 boats and a helicopter, and with the crisp, organized energy of people who have been running a long operation and can finally see its conclusion. Victor Ashcroft was transferred into federal custody in the compound's central room. He walked to the agents without assistance, which Serena observed from across the room. He was going to lawyer up and fight, and the process was going to take years, and he was 70 years old, and his financial network was in the hands of people who would spend the next decade examining every transaction and whatever the legal outcome. The thing he'd built with 30 years of patience was already gone. He looked at her once, across the room, as they walked him out. She returned the look without expression and let him go. Carano cooperated. He began cooperating before the federal agents formally requested it, which was its own information about what he'd decided his options were. He sat with an agent named Whitmore for 4 hours and produced names and dates and account structures with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has calculated that the path through this runs through maximum cooperation and is committed to it without reservation. The names he provided included 2 state officials, 3 executives at legitimate financial institutions, and a federal contract administrator whose involvement in the Romero network would take 2 years to fully prosecute. Marco Fierro was in federal custody and had been since Damiano's people secured him on the Sovereign the previous night. The boat that had launched the harbor attack had been Romero operatives using positioning information that Marco had provided, a final piece of his arrangement, the last obligation he discharged before the whole structure collapsed around him. He would face what he would face. Serena had nothing more to say about Marco Fierro. She had said what she had to say to his face in a hotel room in Charleston, and now the legal process would say the rest of it, and she was finished with him as a subject of attention. Damiano found her at the water's edge, on the eastern side of the island, around 7 in the morning. The sun was coming up over the water, and it was doing what sunrise does, making things look cleaner than they are, the water going pink and gold, and the light hitting the compound buildings behind them, and making them look, briefly, like something other than what they were. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the water for a while. "Reyes is stable," he said. "They've got him on a medical transport." "Good." "The Sovereign is operational. Bow damage, cosmetic, and 1 system compromise we can repair in port." He paused. "We lost 2 people in the harbor, Garza and a man named Pont, who'd been with us 8 months." She absorbed that. "Their families," she said, "already being managed." He looked at the water. "It's what we do." Another silence. "Victor's information about your father," Damiano said carefully, "about the route decision. He told you. He told me what he was going to tell you before we went into the compound. He thought it might—" Damiano paused. "He thought it might fracture your focus." "Did you know? Before last night?" Damiano was quiet for a moment. "I suspected," he said. "I found documentation in 2019 that suggested your father had been briefed on Victor's threats before the attack and hadn't changed the protocol. I didn't have confirmation, and I—" He stopped. "You made a decision about what I was ready to know," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. The profile of him against the morning water, the man who had knelt on a pier in Charleston 2 days ago and said her name like a declaration, who had been carrying pieces of her family's truth for 20 years, and deciding which ones to deliver and when. She thought about the girl she'd been when she'd first trusted him. The specific trust of someone who has nothing else left to trust, placed in whoever is present. "Damiano," she said, "going forward." He turned. "Everything," she said, "every piece of it, every document, every intercept, every suspicion you're running, you bring it to me. I decide what I can handle." She held his gaze. "I am not the 13-year-old in the back of that car anymore. Stop making decisions for her." He held her gaze. Something in him shifted. Not collapse. Nothing in Damiano's architecture collapsed, but a settling, the particular release of a position that has been held too long. "All right," he said. She turned back to the water. "I know what you're going to do with the organization," he said. "I've known since you boarded the Sovereign in Charleston, the direction of it, what you're planning. And I think it's the right thing." He paused. "I also think it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done, and that it's going to take longer than you hope, and that the people who benefit from what you're dismantling are going to fight you every step of it. I know. And I'll be there for every step," he said. "Not as your guardian, not as a proxy for your father's authority or your grandfather's legacy." He looked at the water. As someone who made a 30-year investment in this family and would like to see it finally become what it was supposed to be. She said nothing. But she didn't move away, which, from Serena Vale, was its own language. She found Elias in one of the compound's outer rooms, sitting on a concrete ledge with a cup of coffee that one of the federal agents had apparently provided, looking out at the morning with the expression of a man who has been through something significant and is still in the process of understanding what it means about him. She sat down beside him. Not close. The appropriate distance of two people whose category of relationship has been reclassified several times in the last 72 hours and hasn't arrived anywhere clean. He looked at her. How's your father? Alive, talking. She considered this. Honest. That's... He stopped. I'm glad. She looked at her coffee. Someone had brought her one too, and she didn't remember taking it. The Treasury filing, she said. What you gave Delaney? Yes. That was Voss's material. The proxy fund documentation. And Ashcroft's shell entities, he said. Marco had given you the names and I had the Voss records, and when I put them together I could see the overlap. The 4 Louisiana entities that connected both structures. He looked at his cup. I gave Delaney everything at 2 in the afternoon. She had 5 hours to begin the freeze process before the assault on the Sovereign. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. I didn't know I was going to do it, he said. I walked into the federal building because I was out of moves, and Carano had offered me one that I couldn't take, and I needed to do something. He paused. I'm aware that going to the government with information about the Moretti organization's financial structure is not... It's complicated, she said. Yes. The proxy funds are exposed. Yes. That's $17 million in positions that are now under federal scrutiny. I know. He looked at her directly. I didn't have another tool. I used what I had. She looked at him for a moment. The daylight was on his face now. The morning version of him, unslept, with the particular worn quality of someone who has been afraid for many hours and is now on the other side of it, but hasn't yet rested. She thought about the man who had slid divorce papers across a table without looking up. She thought about the man who had stood in the harbor and not understood what he was seeing. She thought about the man who had gotten into an elevator knowing she might not be glad he'd come. The company, she said. Your company. It's going to be a difficult few months. I know. The investor withdrawals were structured through positions I controlled. I can't restore those without creating a disclosure problem now that the funds are under scrutiny. She said it plainly. Not as an apology, as information. I'm not asking you to restore them, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. She looked at him. I spent 4 years not asking you things I should have asked, he said, starting with who you were, what you came from, why you never argued back. He held the cup in both hands and looked at it. I told myself your quietness was absence. I built a story about what you were that made it easier to do what Leonard told me to do. He paused. The company is mine to rebuild or not rebuild. That's what it should have been the whole time, she said. Raymond's good. He looked at her. Your CFO. He's good. If you give him real authority instead of performing competence at him, he'll stabilize what's left. She said it the way she said most things, cleanly, without cushion. The Harmon contract that fell through 2 years ago. There's a secondary opportunity with the Western subsidiary that nobody followed up on because Leonard redirected the attention. Follow up on it. He stared at her. How do you know about... I owned a significant portion of your company for 3 years, she said. I read the board reports. He was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? He said. She looked at the water. The sun was fully up now, the gold of it becoming ordinary daylight, the water settling back into its regular color. Because you got in the elevator, she said. When you didn't have to. He didn't say anything. She didn't expect him to. They sat there for a while in the compound that had held her father for 11 months on the island off the Louisiana coast, with federal agents moving through the buildings behind them and Damiano's people doing the quiet work of aftermath, and the water in front of them going from gold to blue. Then she stood up. Go home, Elias, she said. Not unkindly. The way you say something when you mean it simply and mean it to be received simply. Go home and rebuild what you can. He looked up at her. And you? She looked at the water. I have an organization to take apart and put back together, she said. In that order. She walked back toward the compound. He watched her go. 3 weeks later, the Mercer Group's board of directors voted to appoint Raymond Chu as co-CEO, effective immediately. The Western subsidiary contract came through 2 weeks after that. It wasn't a restoration of what had been. It was smaller, leaner, more honestly calibrated to what the company actually was, without the inflated investment positions that had made it look larger than its foundations could support. Elias signed the documents and drove home, and sat in his apartment for a long time and didn't call Claudia, who had stopped calling him 11 days ago, and didn't call anyone else, and eventually made himself a meal and ate it at the table he'd had for 6 years, and looked at the chair across from him and thought about things he didn't let himself think about for very long. Leonard Voss was arrested at JFK Airport 11 days after the Charleston events, attempting to board a flight to Zurich with documentation under a secondary identity. He retained 4 lawyers and said nothing publicly, and the federal case against him was described by the DOJ as one of the most complex financial criminal intersections they'd encountered in a decade. He would be in proceedings for years. He was 71 years old. Claudia stopped using his name in public statements within a week. Felix Carano's cooperation produced 36 indictments across 3 states. He was processed separately from Victor and Marco at a facility in Virginia, and his case file was classified at a level that meant most of what he'd provided would not become public record for many years. He had made the calculation he'd made, and he would live inside its consequences, which was what happened when you calculated. Marco Fierro pled guilty to federal charges in a proceeding that took 11 minutes, in which he said nothing except the words required to enter the plea. His sentencing was scheduled for the spring. He had no visitors in the intervening months. He had, as far as anyone could determine, requested none. Victor Ashcroft fought. Of course he did. He was 70 years old and had spent his life believing that the right application of intelligence and resources could manage any outcome, and he applied that belief to his defense with the same systematic patience he'd applied to everything else. He had good lawyers. The case against him was nevertheless overwhelming, not because of what Serena had assembled in 72 hours, but because of what 30 years of careful arrangement left behind. Documents, transactions, communications, the irreducible paper residue of power exercised over time. The things that felt invisible in the doing had left prints everywhere. The trial would take 2 years. The outcome would not be in doubt. He would spend whatever remained of his life inside a version of accountability that he had spent 30 years engineering the universe to avoid. Enzo Vale returned to a private residence in Northern Virginia that the Moretti organization maintained and had nothing to do with his previous life. A clean house, a garden that had been kept up by someone, a kitchen he cooked in because cooking was something he had always done and had been denied for 11 months, and which he returned to with the specific intensity of someone reclaiming a practice that had sustained them in memory when it wasn't available, in fact. He and Serena spoke by secure phone twice a week. The conversations were not easy, and they were not smooth, and they did not, in the early weeks, resolve anything. They were the conversations of 2 people who know each other's most difficult truths and are trying to figure out, from that starting point, what remains and what can be built from it. In November, 6 months after Charleston, he came to New York, where Serena had established the Moretti organization's new operational headquarters in a building that bore no family name and generated no public attention, and housed, on its upper floors, the legal, financial, and logistics infrastructure of what was being quietly and systematically transformed from a criminal syndicate into something that occupied the same territory by different means. It was slow work, the kind of work that didn't have a climax or a moment of completion, just the daily grind of dismantling one thing while building another, of managing the people whose livelihoods had been structured around the old operations and needed to be transitioned toward new ones, of saying no to things that had previously been said yes to and weathering the friction that produced, and saying yes to things that had previously been inconceivable and managing the learning curve that required. Serena did this work. She did it with the same quality she'd carried through everything, not the quietness the world had mistaken for absence, but the patience of someone who understood that real change happened in the increments, in the sustained daily application of will and intelligence, and the refusal to be hurried by impatience or deterred by resistance. Damiano was there, not in front of her, beside her. The adjustment had taken him several weeks, but he'd made it, because Damiano Moretti was many things, and one of those things was honest enough, when it mattered, to revise. On the day Enzo arrived in New York, Serena met him in the lobby of the building and walked him upstairs, past the offices where people she'd hired were doing the work she'd given them, past the conference rooms where meetings happened that looked, from the outside, exactly like what they actually were, a logistics and security company with a global footprint, and into the office at the end of the top floor that had a window facing south. Enzo stood at the window for a long time. He looked at the city. He looked at his daughter's desk, the organized surface of it, the absence of clutter, the single photograph that sat to the left of the monitor. He walked to the desk and looked at the photograph. It was old, the edges soft with age, the color slightly faded. It was a photograph of his wife, taken years before she died, in a garden somewhere, laughing at something outside the frame. He hadn't known Serena had it. He picked it up and held it for a moment. Then he set it down very carefully in exactly the place it had been. He turned and looked at Serena, who was standing in the doorway watching him with the specific expression she had, the one that gave little away on the surface and had a great deal moving beneath it. "Your mother would have liked this version of it," he said. "What you're building." "She would have had opinions about my management style," Serena said. "Yes," Enzo said. "She would have." Something moved between them. Not the warmth of uncomplicated closeness, not that, not yet, but the first tentative architecture of something that had been damaged and was being repaired with materials that were honest about their own imperfections. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the desk. "Sit down, Papa," she said. "I'll get someone to bring coffee. There's a lot I want your opinion on." He sat down. She sat across from him. Outside the window, New York went about itself in the ordinary way of a city that did not know and would not know what had happened in Charleston and Louisiana and a hotel corridor and a compound stairwell, all the private upheaval that had preceded this unremarkable office, this desk, this coffee not yet arrived, this father and daughter beginning the long and imperfect work of knowing each other again. That evening, as the light went out of the sky over the water, the Sovereign left its berth in the harbor where it had spent 6 weeks undergoing repairs and moved south, running lights on, its repaired bow cutting the dark water cleanly. Serena stood on the aft deck as the city lights fell behind. Damiano came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The water moved past the hull with the steady, indifferent patience of water, and the dark was wide, and the ship went forward the way ships do when they have somewhere to be, and the sea is open and there is enough fuel for the distance. She had signed the papers in that kitchen 4 years ago without a word and walked out with a small suitcase and believed, for a brief and necessary time, that the quietest version of herself was the safest one. She knew now that the quiet had never been safety. It had been preparation, the long, unannounced accumulation of something that had no name until the moment it was required, and then it had every name. The city disappeared. The water was dark and wide and the ship moved through it. She stayed on the deck until the lights were gone.